On July 24th, 1847, the first Mormon pioneers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. This, their prophet and leader Brigham Young said, was the place. At least, that's the story of Pioneer Day many of us are familiar with. More than a century and a half later, the holiday is a Utah staple. But how true is that mythology? And what about the state's history does it leave out? This Pioneer Day, I wanted to find out.
The basics of that mythology are true.
This is Mark Melville, the assistant editor for the Utah Historical Quarterly, a journal published by the Utah Historical Society. Melville is an expert on the history of Pioneer Days past and present.
He gazed at the vast expanse of desert and mountains and declared, "This is the right place."
One of the first misconceptions that we have about Pioneer Day is that all of the pioneers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley on July 24th, and that they immediately settled into the area.
A lot of them actually, including Brigham Young, went right back to Iowa. They were here about a month before they went back, and then they came again in 1848. Our definition of pioneer has changed quite a bit over the years. So initially, when they referred to pioneers, they were referring only to that vanguard company of July 1847. By the end of the 19th century, anyone who arrived in 1847, even if it wasn't part of that first group, they were considered pioneers. And then early 20th century, anyone who arrived before 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, they were considered to be pioneers. It's shifted quite a bit over the years. We often think of handcarts, but that was just a very small percentage of Mormon pioneers, and they didn't really become a part of the story till like the 1890s.
The first Pioneer Day was celebrated in 1849, 2 years after the first pioneers arrived in the area.
It wasn't called Pioneer Day at the time. We didn't call it Pioneer Day until the 1870s, but it was really looked identical to the 4th of July. So Latter-day Saints in Illinois, Joseph Smith, their leader, is killed a week before the 4th of July in 1844. And so for a few years after that, Latter-day Saints feel like the United States has let them down. It has not lived up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, and they kind of resent the 4th of July. By 1849, they're kind of ambivalent about the 4th of July. Some who are in Iowa do celebrate the 4th of July in 1849. In Utah, they don't celebrate the 4th of July, but they celebrate the 24th. And it looks just like the 4th of July for the 19th century.
Our celebrations today look fairly similar. But over time, Pioneer Day came to celebrate not just the pioneers, but Utah history as a whole. And in the mid-2000s, a twist on the holiday for non-LDS Utahns came about: Pie and Beer Day.
The 24th of July has always maintained close ties with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so people who are not part of the church can feel left out. And that has been the case since there's been a 24th of July celebration. There's always been this tension between them. And so Pie and Beer Day is part of this tension that you see all these parade floats that are very religious, very Latter-day Saint centric. And if you're not part of that, what is in Pioneer Day for you?
There are other tensions evoked by the celebration of Pioneer Day, particularly for Indigenous people native to the area the pioneers settled.
They learned how to make their new desert homeland literally blossom as a rose by developing irrigation systems which transformed the parched earth into moist, fertile soil.
The arrival of the pioneers marked a turning point in the state's history, and Brigham Young, the LDS prophet who led the pioneers across the plains, saw it as civilizing the area.
We shall build a city and a temple to the Most High God in this place. We will extend our settlements to the east and west, to the north and south, and we will build towns and cities by the hundreds, and thousands of the saints will gather in from the nations of the earth. This will become the great highway of the nations. Kings and emperors and the noble and wise of the earth will visit us here, while the wicked and ungodly will envy us our comfortable homes and possessions. Take courage, brethren. I can stand in my door and see where there is untold millions of the rich treasures of the earth, gold and silver.
By the time the pioneers arrived, Indigenous people had been living in the area for thousands of years. Forrest Cuch is a Ute elder and an author and the former director of the Utah Division of Indian Affairs. For him, Pioneer Day celebrations evoke a history that isn't often talked about. We recently met in Provo to discuss the Indigenous perspective on the state's unique history. Today, many Utahns think of the Ute tribe as being located in the northern part of the state, where the reservation is today. But Cuch's ancestors lived in the Provo area, near Utah Lake. And when he teaches about the history of his people, he often notes that there's a stereotype today that the Utes were starving and desolate. But before the late 19th century, that was not the case.
What they found here was pretty much a paradise. It was a very prized and bountiful place because it had lots of vegetation. I'm sure there were a lot more trees back then, and lots of wildlife is what we're told. We're told that the Timpanogos, Tompanawats band, also called Tompanawats fish eaters, didn't have to go too far for their food. 30% of their diet came from fish, Bonneville cutthroat trout and other species of fish in this lake.
When the pioneers did arrive, there was no immediate tension between the Utes and the LDS settlers, Cuch said.
The first reaction is it's okay. Their values were first and foremost belief in the Creator, and also they believed strongly in sharing. They believed in the importance of generosity and in reciprocity and sharing, and so their first reaction is, sure, we will share, people need to eat.
But that changed as the pioneers moved further south, letting their cattle graze closer to Timpanogos land and hauling out wagon loads of fish from Utah Lake. Eventually, tensions between the LDS settlers and the Ute people in the area came to a head in January 1850 with the Fort Utah War.
There are two versions about why that happened. One was that this old Indian named Old Bishop, he stole a shirt off of the line and put it on, and it got reported that this man stole a shirt, so some settlers found him, killed him, opened his belly and filled it with rocks and threw him in the Provo River over here. That's the Mormon version. The Indian version is that old man Bishop caught those three men poaching deer on the river. And at the time, the Indians complained about the settlers killing all their wild game, and they weren't allowed to kill a cow or a domestic animal. So the old man caught them and was going to report them, and they decided to kill him and cut him open, fill him with rocks, and throw him in the river.
LDS settlers attacked the Ute band and killed between 40 and 100 Ute men and 1 or 2 Ute women. One settler was killed. Some of the Utes who survived fled from the area. Others, including women and children, were captured, and some were sold as slaves to the LDS people in the area. According to Melville, Indigenous people in the area were originally included in some of the earliest celebrations of Pioneer Day. But as the pioneers settled into the valley over the coming decades, the relationship worsened.
Latter-day Saints had a specific theological worldview that placed Indigenous people as part of the house of Israel that needed to be gathered and restored. They also were part of the American culture that viewed Indigenous peoples as inferior and needing to be saved and redeemed. And so there were acts of violence against them.
I'd like to present you this Book of Mormon. And you're right, it is your book.
Euro-Americans thought that their way of life was best, and so they tried to have Indigenous peoples farm like Euro-Americans did. They wanted them to integrate into the culture, and that's why we have them like going to farms, which was not something they were used to.
Today, some tellings of pioneer history lack any mention of the Indigenous people in the area at all. Cuch and I went to Pioneer Village in Provo. The first sentence on the museum's About Us page reads, "Experience the life of the pioneers as you walk back into the early days of Provo, when the settlers of 1849 had to survive in isolation." This description doesn't sit right with him.
I have trouble with the word isolation. Did they mean isolation from other white folks or human beings, because the Indians were still here, and they were being pressured. Their resources were in decline, while the settlers, they were benefiting from their produce, the things that they were growing, as well as the fish and the wildlife, the resources in this area. So they weren't isolated. There were human beings here. They just chose not to interact with them as human beings.
History, Forrest says, is not just a telling of objective facts. It has a perspective.
The conqueror writes the history, right? And for some reason, the conquerors always have this idea that if they tell the truth, something bad might happen. They might lose support, or people might not want to be part of the white race. And that is foolish.
Melville agrees that remembering our history is less straightforward than many people think it is.
There are objective facts in history that this happened and this happened, but the way we tell that story can change depending on whose perspective we're using, what we're trying to accomplish with that history. So if you're telling your doctor your health history, the details from your life that you're telling him are going to be very different from the details you might tell your children about how you met your spouse.
And remembering the failings of the pioneers, he said, doesn't mean we can't celebrate them and the role that they played in the state's history.
Both the good and the bad. So we have this mythology, the pioneers were brave and courageous and we should try to be like them. But the pioneers also did things that didn't work. They tried to build a sugar mill in Sugar House, and they didn't really know how to process sugar beets. They tried to set up a settlement in Las Vegas in the 1850s, but that didn't last. They were human, and so we can learn from their mistakes just as well as we can learn from their successes. And understanding that helps us better know why we are here today, where we came from, and how we can improve in the future.
And Cuch's wish is that people would recognize the mistakes from the past before they celebrate it, and that state and local governments in the area would make a point to develop deeper relationships with tribal leaders.
And out of those discussions will evolve meaningful changes that will make this valley alive again. And I say that not to insult folks in this area, but what I'm saying is that this place needs to become, there needs to be a new consciousness here of living with nature, giving to nature instead of always taking. You know, what can we do to make this place more sustainable, more beautiful, and how can we not be so harmful to the earth and the resources in this area? What can we do to live in harmony with it, and eventually harmony with each other? Those are the questions that need to be asked.